The sun was dropping low behind the jagged Wyoming hills, bleeding orange light across miles of dry grass that whispered against the wind like it carried old secrets. Dust rolled lazily behind the battered pickup truck as it crept along a forgotten county road. The truck looked older than most of the fences lining the fields, its red paint faded to a tired rust, its engine humming with the stubborn determination of something that had seen too much to quit now. Behind the wheel sat Boone Carter, known around 3 counties simply as Boone the Quiet. He was a tall man shaped by years of hard ranch work and long winters that hardened both the land and the men who tried to tame it. His face carried deep creases carved by sun and time, and his gray, flecked beard framed a mouth that rarely smiled anymore. In the passenger seat sat his 7-year-old daughter, Ellie. She was the opposite of Boone in almost every way, bright-eyed, curious, and forever leaning toward the window, as if the world might disappear if she blinked too long. Her brown braids bounced softly against her shoulders as she pressed her small palm against the dusty glass. They hadn't spoken in nearly 20 miles. Boone preferred silence when he drove. Silence helped him think. Silence helped him forget. But Ellie was never one to let silence win. "Papa," she asked softly. Boone grunted in response, eyes still on the road. She shifted in her seat, knees tucked under her chin. "Are we almost at the northern pasture?" "Another 15 minutes, he replied, his voice gravelly like stones grinding together. Ellie nodded, though she clearly had more to say. She always did. Boone could feel it building like a summer storm. They rounded a bend where the road dipped between 2 long stretches of abandoned farmland. The fields had once belonged to the Henderson family before the drought swallowed their cattle and the bank swallowed their home. Now the land sat hollow and skeletal, dotted with broken fence posts leaning like exhausted soldiers. That was when Ellie suddenly sat up straight. "Papa, stop." Boone frowned but kept driving. "What is it, Peanut?" "Stop the truck," she insisted, urgency rising in her voice. Boone sighed and eased his foot off the gas, gravel crunching as the pickup rolled to a slow halt. He followed Ellie's gaze toward the roadside ditch where tall weeds swayed in the wind. At first he saw nothing, then something moved. 2 small figures crouched near the shattered remains of an old cattle gate. Boone squinted, leaning forward over the steering wheel. The shapes shifted again, revealing thin limbs and tangled hair catching the dying sunlight. Children. Boone felt his chest tighten instantly. Ellie was already unbuckling her seatbelt. "Stay in the truck," Boone said firmly, but she hesitated, eyes wide and glassy. "Papa, they look scared." "That ain't our business," Boone muttered, though he already felt his grip tightening around the steering wheel. Ellie turned to him slowly, her voice quieter now, almost fragile. "They look like I would be if you didn't come back for me that day." The words hit him harder than he expected. Boone's jaw clenched as memories surged uninvited. Cold hospital lights, machines beeping, Ellie clutching his sleeve when her mother never came home from surgery. He swallowed the thought like bitter medicine. He opened the truck door and stepped out. The wind hit him first, sharp and dry. His boots crunched against gravel as he approached slowly, hands raised slightly to avoid startling them. The 2 children were huddled together, a boy who looked about 10 and a girl maybe 4 years old. Their clothes were torn and dust-stained, their faces streaked with dirt and something darker Boone recognized too well: fear. The boy immediately stepped in front of the little girl, shoulders squared in defiance that didn't quite hide the tremble in his legs. "Don't come closer," the boy said, his voice cracking. Boone stopped several feet away, lowering himself slightly so he wouldn't tower over them. "I ain't here to hurt you," Boone said calmly. The boy didn't respond, but his eyes darted between Boone and the truck where Ellie was now kneeling on the seat, watching through the window. "Where are your folks?" Boone asked. The boy hesitated. His lips parted, then pressed together tightly. "They left," he said finally. Boone felt a chill crawl up his spine. "Left where?" The boy shook his head slowly. "Just left." The little girl peeked around him, her tiny fingers clutching the back of his shirt. Her cheeks were streaked with tears that had dried into pale trails across her dirt-smudged face. "What's your names?" Boone asked gently. "Caleb," the boy said after a moment. He glanced down at the girl. "And this is Rosie." Boone nodded slowly. "How long you been out here, Caleb?" "2 days," Caleb answered. The words hung heavy in the air. Boone's stomach twisted. 2 days in this stretch of land meant no food, no shelter, and coyotes that howled through the nights like they were calling the lost home to darkness. Ellie suddenly burst out of the truck before Boone could stop her. She ran toward them, her boots kicking dust behind her. "Ellie!" Boone barked, but she didn't stop. She approached slowly once she got close, her expression soft and careful like she was trying not to scare a wounded animal. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out the half-eaten peanut butter sandwich she had saved from lunch. "You can have this," she said, holding it out. Rosie's eyes locked onto the sandwich instantly. Caleb hesitated. His pride wrestled against his hunger in a battle Boone had seen grown men lose. "Go ahead," Boone said quietly. Caleb slowly took the sandwich, splitting it carefully before handing the larger piece to Rosie. The little girl devoured it with desperate urgency. Ellie smiled softly, then looked back at Boone, and that was when she said it. "Papa, can we take them home?" The words fell into the fading daylight like a stone into still water, rippling outward through Boone's chest. Boone stared at the two children, thin, frightened, abandoned on land that had already taken too much from too many. He thought about his ranch barely staying afloat after last winter's brutal storms. He thought about unpaid feed bills stacked on his kitchen table. He thought about how hard it already was raising Ellie alone. And yet, he looked at Rosie licking crumbs from her fingers. He looked at Caleb standing taller than he should have to for his age. And then he looked at Ellie, his daughter whose heart still believed the world could be kinder than it often was. Boone exhaled slowly, the wind carrying dust and the distant cry of a hawk overhead. The road stretched endlessly behind them, and for the first time in years, Boone Carter felt like he had reached a crossroads he couldn't outrun. Boone didn't answer Ellie right away. The question lingered between them, carried by the wind rustling through the brittle grass. He rubbed the back of his neck, staring at the empty road stretching past the broken cattle gate. His instincts, the ones forged from years of survival, debt, and loss, told him this was trouble. Trouble came disguised in many forms out here. Sometimes it wore a friendly smile, sometimes it wore desperate eyes, and sometimes it wore the face of hungry children. "We don't even know where they came from," Boone finally said, his voice careful, steady, like he was trying to convince himself as much as Ellie. Caleb stiffened at the words, pulling Rosie slightly behind him again. Ellie stepped closer to Boone, lowering her voice. "We can find out at home." Boone sighed heavily. "Ellie, they're scared," she whispered, "and they're alone." The weight in her words hit him deeper than he wanted to admit. Boone glanced back toward the children. Caleb's jaw was tight, but Boone recognized the exhaustion in his eyes. The boy had been trying to be strong far longer than any child should. Boone crouched down slowly in front of them again. "Caleb," he said, "you got anywhere else you can go? Family, neighbors, anybody?" Caleb hesitated. His lips trembled slightly before he shook his head. "We were staying in a trailer with Mama," he said quietly, "near the old gravel pit." Boone knew the place. It had been abandoned for years, used occasionally by drifters or folks hiding from debts, the law, or both. "What happened to your mama?" Boone asked gently. Caleb swallowed hard. Rosie clutched his shirt tighter. "She went to town 3 days ago," he said. "Said she'd bring food back." Boone's chest tightened. "She didn't come back?" he asked. Caleb shook his head. Boone stood slowly, his joints protesting with age and years of ranch labor. He turned away from them for a moment, staring out across the fading horizon. He knew what this meant more often than not. Parents didn't just vanish for 3 days in these parts, unless something had gone terribly wrong. Ellie stepped beside him, her small hand slipping into his rough, calloused one. "Papa," she said softly, "if Mama left me somewhere, you'd want someone to help me, wouldn't you?" Boone closed his eyes briefly. He saw flashes of his late wife, Margaret, her laugh echoing across summer fields, her hands guiding Ellie's first steps, her voice whispering comfort during long nights of storms. Margaret had always been the kind of person who stopped for strangers, fed neighbors, and left porch lights on for anyone who might need shelter. Boone had never been that kind of person, but Margaret had been. And Ellie had inherited her mother's heart in ways Boone both admired and feared. He exhaled slowly and turned back toward Caleb and Rosie. "You too hungry?" he asked. Rosie nodded instantly. Caleb hesitated but eventually nodded too. Boone tilted his head toward the truck. "All right then, you can ride with us back to the ranch, just for tonight. We'll figure things out in the morning." Ellie gasped, her face lighting like sunrise. "Thank you, Papa." Caleb didn't move at first. His suspicion still lingered like a shadow. "You promise you ain't gonna call the cops?" he asked quietly. Boone paused. He considered lying, considered dodging the question. But he had learned long ago that children who had been abandoned could smell dishonesty faster than wolves smelled blood. "I promise I'm gonna do what's best to keep you safe," Boone said honestly. "Sometimes that means talking to folks who can help. But tonight, you got my word you'll have a warm bed and a hot meal." Caleb studied him carefully. Something in Boone's steady tone finally softened the boy's stance. He nodded. Boone helped Rosie into the back seat while Caleb climbed in beside her. Ellie squeezed in between them, instantly offering Rosie her worn stuffed rabbit named Clover. "This helps when I'm scared," Ellie said kindly. Rosie clutched the toy like it was made of gold. Boone climbed back into the driver's seat, glancing at the rearview mirror. The sight behind him, his daughter sitting shoulder to shoulder with two children he'd met 10 minutes ago, made something uneasy stir in his chest. He started the engine. The truck rumbled forward, tires crunching over gravel as they pulled back onto the lonely road toward Carter Ranch. The sky darkened quickly as they drove. Wyoming nights didn't wait politely for travelers to reach safety. They swallowed daylight with ruthless speed. Inside the truck, Ellie chatted softly with Rosie while Caleb remained mostly silent, his watchful eyes scanning every passing mile marker. After several minutes, Caleb finally spoke. "You really got a ranch?" Boone nodded. "Small one. Used to be bigger before the drought." "You got animals?" "Couple dozen cattle. Few horses. More chores than daylight most days." Caleb leaned back slightly, absorbing the answer. Rosie yawned loudly, her head eventually resting against Ellie's shoulder. Within minutes, she was asleep. Ellie smiled down at her gently. Boone noticed. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, wondering if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life, or the most important decision he would ever face. By the time they reached the ranch, night had fully settled across the land. The Carter property spread across several dusty acres surrounded by aging wooden fences and wind-bent cottonwood trees. The main house stood sturdy but worn, its porch light glowing warmly against the darkness. The barn loomed nearby, its red paint peeling but proud. Boone parked the truck near the porch. Caleb stepped out slowly, scanning everything like he was mapping escape routes. "You can sleep inside," Boone said, grabbing a lantern from the truck bed. Ellie gently woke Rosie, guiding her toward the house. Inside, Boone set plates of reheated stew on the kitchen table. Caleb and Rosie ate like they hadn't seen food in weeks. Ellie sat with them, occasionally sliding her cornbread toward Rosie when she thought Boone wasn't looking. Boone noticed. He noticed everything. Later, after Ellie helped Rosie wash up and showed them to the spare bedroom, Boone stood alone on the porch staring out across his quiet land. The stars stretched endlessly above him, sharp and cold. Footsteps creaked behind him. Ellie stepped onto the porch, wrapping herself in her oversized flannel pajama shirt. "Are they staying?" she asked softly. Boone stared at the horizon. "I don't know," he admitted. Ellie leaned against his arm. "I hope so." Boone didn't respond, because deep down he already felt something shifting, like the land beneath him was preparing to crack open and force him into a decision he wasn't ready to make. And the worst part, he had a feeling this was only the beginning. Boone didn't sleep much that night. He sat at the kitchen table long after everyone else had gone to bed, the dim overhead light flickering occasionally like it shared his unease. The ledger book lay open in front of him, filled with numbers that refused to add up no matter how many times he recalculated them. Feed costs rising, equipment repairs overdue, bank payments looming like storm clouds on the horizon. Now 2 more mouths to feed. Boone rubbed his tired eyes and leaned back in his chair. Through the hallway, he could hear faint sounds. Ellie's soft snoring, the occasional creak of the house settling, and once, the faint murmur of Rosie crying in her sleep before Ellie's whisper soothed her back into silence. Boone stared at the ceiling. Margaret would have known what to do. The thought struck him with familiar sharpness. She had always believed kindness wasn't something you measured against cost. She believed it multiplied, grew, and returned in ways numbers never could. Boone had spent years trying to live by logic instead of hope. But tonight, logic felt thin. Just before sunrise, Boone stepped outside. The cold morning air hit him like a slap, clearing his thoughts slightly. Frost clung to the fence rails and shimmered across the pasture grass. His cattle moved slowly in the distance, their low murmurs echoing across the quiet land. Boone grabbed a bucket and headed toward the barn, hoping routine would steady his mind. Halfway there, he heard footsteps running behind him. "Papa, wait." He turned as Ellie jogged toward him, boots half-laced, jacket thrown over her pajamas. "You should still be sleeping," he said. "I wanted to help feed the horses," she replied, slightly out of breath. Boone raised an eyebrow. "You hate early mornings." "Not today," she said with a grin. Boone shook his head but allowed her to follow. As they entered the barn, the horses nickered softly in greeting. Ellie moved quickly toward her favorite mare, Daisy, brushing frost from the animal's mane while Boone poured grain into feeding troughs. "Rosie's still asleep," Ellie said casually. "And Caleb?" Boone asked. Ellie hesitated. "He's sitting on the porch." Boone paused. "Doing what?" "Watching the road," Ellie answered quietly. Boone felt a familiar heaviness settle in his chest. When chores were done, Boone returned toward the house. Sure enough, Caleb sat on the porch steps, elbows resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the long dirt road stretching beyond the ranch gate. "You expecting someone?" Boone asked, stepping beside him. Caleb shrugged. "Maybe." Boone sat beside him. For several moments, neither spoke. Finally, Caleb said, "Mama always came back before." The words landed heavy between them. Boone nodded slowly. "Sometimes grown-ups run into trouble they don't mean to." Caleb glanced at him. "You think she's in trouble?" Boone chose his next words carefully. "I think until we know for sure, it's all right to hope she's safe." Caleb stared back at the road. "Hope don't fill stomachs," he muttered. Boone couldn't argue with that. Behind them, the screen door creaked open. Rosie stepped outside clutching Ellie's stuffed rabbit, her hair tangled from sleep. Ellie followed, holding 2 mugs of hot cocoa she had somehow convinced herself counted as breakfast. Rosie spotted Caleb and ran to him. He wrapped an arm around her protectively. Boone watched the moment quietly. He had spent years believing survival meant protecting only what was already yours. But standing there, watching these 2 children cling to each other like lifelines, he wasn't sure where that line ended anymore. And just as Boone opened his mouth to speak again, a distant engine echoed across the valley. All 4 of them turned toward the ranch gate as a dust trail rose along the road. A sheriff's cruiser. Boone's stomach dropped. The vehicle rolled closer, sunlight glinting off its windshield as it slowed near the gate. Sheriff Dale Mercer stepped out, adjusting his hat as he approached with slow, deliberate strides. Boone stood, instinctively placing himself slightly in front of the children. "Morning, Boone," Mercer called. "Sheriff," Boone replied cautiously. Mercer's gaze shifted toward Caleb and Rosie. "We got reports of 2 missing kids matching their description," he said. Ellie grabbed Boone's hand tightly. Caleb's entire body tensed. Rosie buried her face against his side. Mercer continued, voice steady but serious. "And Boone, there's more you need to hear." Boone felt the ground shift beneath him. Because in that moment, he realized something deep and unavoidable. The choice he thought he made last night was only the beginning. The real choice was about to arrive at his doorstep. Sheriff Dale Mercer removed his hat as he stepped onto the Carter porch, a gesture Boone had learned to read over the years. Dale only took his hat off when news was heavy, or when he wished it wasn't his job to carry it. The morning sun stretched across the ranch yard, turning the frost into glimmering dew, but the warmth never quite reached Boone's chest as he stood with Ellie at his side and the 2 children behind him. "Mind if I come in?" Mercer asked. Boone nodded once. "Coffee's on." They gathered around the kitchen table, the same place Boone had stared at numbers the night before. Now the ledger book was pushed aside, replaced by 4 steaming mugs. Caleb sat stiffly, one hand resting protectively on Rosie's shoulder while Ellie quietly held Rosie's other hand beneath the table. Mercer cleared his throat. "We found your mama's car," he said, looking directly at Caleb. The boy's face went pale, but he said nothing. "Where?" Boone asked. "Near the interstate outside Laramie, abandoned in a gas station lot." Caleb's fingers tightened around Rosie's sleeve. Rosie didn't fully understand, but she sensed the tension and pressed closer into him. "Any sign of her?" Boone asked carefully. Mercer hesitated. That hesitation told Boone everything before the sheriff even spoke again. "Security cameras caught her getting into a pickup with 2 men, Mercer said. "We're still investigating." Caleb's voice cracked. "Was she forced?" Mercer met the boy's gaze gently. "We don't know yet." The kitchen fell silent except for the faint ticking of the wall clock and the low hum of the refrigerator. Boone felt Ellie's grip tightening around his arm. He placed his rough hand over hers without thinking. "What happens to them now?" Boone asked quietly. Mercer sighed. "Child Services will likely step in. They'll be placed in temporary foster care until we locate their mother, or determine if she's able to return." The words landed like a hammer strike. "No," Ellie whispered under her breath, barely audible. Caleb stood abruptly, knocking his chair backward. "We're not going anywhere," he said, his voice shaking but fierce. Rosie started crying immediately, clutching Clover tightly to her chest. Mercer raised his hands calmly. "Son, nobody's trying to scare you. But there are rules. They'll split us up," Caleb said, tears burning in his eyes. "They always split kids up." Boone's stomach twisted. Mercer looked at Boone, the silent understanding passing between 2 men who had grown up in the same dust and hardship. "You got any legal claim here, Boone?" Mercer asked. Boone shook his head slowly. "No." Mercer nodded. "Then I'll have to make the call by noon." Ellie suddenly stood, her chair scraping loudly across the wooden floor. "They can stay here," she said firmly. Mercer offered her a sad smile. "It ain't that simple, sweetheart." Boone stared at the tabletop. His mind raced through logistics, finances, responsibilities, and the countless ways this could go wrong. He thought about foreclosure notices tucked inside his desk drawer. He thought about the winter feed supply barely lasting through March. He thought about how he had barely managed to keep Ellie clothed, fed, and smiling after Margaret's death. Taking in 2 more children wasn't just charity. It was survival gambling with loaded dice. But then he heard Rosie's quiet sobs. He heard Caleb whispering promises he wasn't sure he could keep. And he heard Ellie's trembling voice. "Papa, please." Boone closed his eyes. Memories surged again. Margaret kneeling beside a stranded traveler during a snowstorm, insisting they share their last blankets. Margaret baking extra bread for families who never asked but always needed. Margaret once told him, "The hardest choices ain't about what you can afford, Boone. They're about what you can live with afterward." Boone opened his eyes slowly. "How long?" he asked. Mercer frowned. "How long what?" "How long before child services shows up?" Mercer checked his watch. "Couple hours at most." Boone nodded once, the decision forming in his chest like thunder rolling across plains. "Then I'm filing for temporary guardianship," Boone said. Ellie gasped in relief. Caleb stared at him stunned. Mercer leaned back in his chair, eyebrows raised. "Boone, you understand what that means. Home inspections, financial reviews, court hearings, and if they decide you can't support them." "I understand," Boone said quietly. Mercer studied him for a long moment. "You sure about this?" Boone glanced at the children. "No," he admitted honestly. "But I'm sure about not turning them away." The following days blurred into a whirlwind Boone had never prepared for. Government paperwork stacked higher than hay bales. Social workers walked through his home measuring safety, stability, and something far harder to quantify, love. Ellie followed every inspection like it was a sacred ceremony, proudly showing Rosie her room, her toys, even her favorite reading spot under the staircase. Rosie clung to her constantly, while Caleb maintained cautious distance, always watching, always measuring Boone like he expected disappointment to arrive any moment. One afternoon, Boone found Caleb repairing a loose hinge on the barn door. "You handy with tools?" Boone asked. Caleb shrugged. "Mama moved us around a lot. Had to fix things when they broke." Boone nodded slowly, handing him a better screwdriver. "Try this one. Less likely to strip the screws." Caleb accepted it cautiously. After several minutes of silent work, he spoke again. "Why are you doing this?" Boone leaned against the barn wall. "Doing what?" "Taking us in," Caleb said. "You barely know us." Boone stared across the pasture where Ellie and Rosie chased butterflies through tall grass. "Sometimes knowing enough is all you get," Boone said quietly. Caleb tightened the last screw and stepped back, testing the hinge. It swung smoothly. "You think Mama's coming back?" Caleb asked. Boone hesitated. "I think she'd want you safe." Caleb nodded slightly, though doubt clouded his expression. Inside the house, Ellie helped Rosie practice writing her name. The little girl struggled with the R, her tongue poking out in fierce concentration. Ellie clapped enthusiastically every time Rosie managed to form the letter halfway correctly. Later that evening, Boone received a call from Sheriff Mercer. "They found her," Mercer said. Boone's heart jumped. "Alive?" "Yes." "But Boone, she's in serious trouble." Mercer explained that Caleb and Rosie's mother had been caught transporting stolen pharmaceuticals across state lines. She claimed she had been coerced, but the evidence was complicated, and charges were already being filed. She could be looking at years. Mercer finished. Boone stared out at the barn lights flickering against twilight. "Do the kids know?" he asked.
"Not yet,"
Mercer replied. "That's up to you." Boone ended the call and stood frozen in the kitchen. Telling them meant shattering their last thread of hope. Not telling them meant living inside a lie. He stepped outside where the children were feeding chickens together. Ellie laughed as Rosie squealed when one pecked too close to her boot. Caleb smiled faintly, the first real smile Boone had seen from him. Boone realized something in that moment. The children weren't just surviving anymore. They were beginning to belong, and telling them the truth might destroy that fragile ground beneath their feet. But Boone Carter had learned one painful lesson in life. Truth always found its way through silence eventually. That night, Boone gathered them around the living room fireplace. The crackling flames painted flickering shadows across the walls, and outside the Wyoming wind howled softly across the plains like it carried old ghosts with it. Ellie sat cross-legged beside Rosie, holding her hand. Caleb sat stiffly in the armchair, sensing what was coming before Boone even spoke. "I talked to Sheriff Mercer today," Boone began slowly. Caleb's shoulders tensed instantly. "They found your mama." Rosie's eyes lit up. "She coming home?" Boone's chest tightened painfully. "No, sweetheart," he said gently. She's going to be away for a long time." Rosie's lip trembled before tears spilled down her cheeks. Ellie pulled her into a tight hug, whispering comfort into her tangled hair. Caleb didn't cry. He simply stared into the fire, his jaw clenched so tightly Boone feared his teeth might crack. "She left us," Caleb said flatly. Boone shook his head slowly. "I don't think she wanted to." Caleb finally looked at him, anger flashing in his eyes. "Everybody says that." Boone leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. "I can't promise you everything will be okay," Boone said honestly. "But I can promise you this ranch is open to you, as long as you want it to be." The room fell silent except for Rosie's quiet sobs. Ellie looked at Boone, tears streaming down her own cheeks but smiling bravely. "Does that mean they're staying?" she asked. Boone nodded slowly. "If the courts approve guardianship, yes." Rosie looked up, clutching Clover tightly. "We can stay with Ellie." Ellie nodded eagerly. "Forever if you want." Caleb stared at Boone, searching his face for weakness, doubt, or hesitation. He found none, only quiet determination worn into every line of Boone's weathered face. "You sure you can handle us?" Caleb asked. Boone allowed himself the faintest smile. "Son," he said, "this ranch has survived droughts, blizzards, and one stubborn cowboy who refuses to quit. I reckon it can handle a little more life." For the first time, Caleb's defenses cracked completely. Tears rolled silently down his face as he lowered his head. Boone didn't reach out. He knew some battles had to be surrendered privately, but he sat close enough for the boy to know he wasn't alone anymore. Outside, the wind slowed. The stars stretched wide above Carter Ranch, watching over a home that had grown larger in ways fences and land could never measure. Boone leaned back in his chair, exhaustion and peace settling over him together. For years, he had believed survival meant holding on to what little you had. Now he understood something Margaret had always known. Sometimes survival meant opening your door wide enough for love to walk in, even when it arrived wearing dust, fear, and uncertain futures. Ellie yawned, resting her head against Boone's shoulder. Rosie curled beside her, finally asleep. Caleb sat quietly across from them, the firelight reflecting in eyes no longer entirely lost. Boone stared into the flames, feeling the weight of responsibility settle into his bones. It wasn't light, but it was right. And for the first time since Margaret's passing, Boone Carter didn't feel like he was just surviving the road ahead. He felt like he was finally walking it with a purpose he could never escape and no longer wanted to.